Hello friends, my name is Marines, and today I'll be talking about unreliable narrators. I recently read Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh, one of the books nominated for the 2016 Man Booker Longlist, and it got me thinking about unreliable narrators. I have complex feelings about this book and about the reading experience as a whole because the main character is so unlikable. In this book, we never hear in so many words that Eileen is an unreliable narrator, but she does slip in these things to her own storytelling about how she can't be sure that this was specifically what she said or that this was specifically what happened. Throughout the period in her life that she's also telling us about, Eileen is drinking heavily, she's very emotionally unstable, she's stalking people, just her life in general and how she comes across and everything that is happening makes it seem like she is not the most trustworthy person. It's almost two different things because in her actions you question her integrity, but also you know that she is not in a healthy state, so you question her ability to tell you a true story. In that very specific way, Eileen reminded me of The Sense of an Ending by Julian Barnes. In this book, a man named Tony is reflecting on his life. He's in his 60s and he starts kind of looking back and reflecting after an ex-girlfriend re-enters his life. Tony thinks a lot about the failure of his own memory and how things he might have perceived one way when they actually happened probably didn't happen that way at all. Barnes writes about it this way. How often do we tell our own life story? How often do we adjust, embellish, make slight cuts? And the longer life goes on, the fewer are those around to challenge our account, to remind us that our life is not our life, merely the story we have told about our life, told to others, but mainly to ourselves. When we consume a story in whatever format, we usually go into it trusting that the narrator is telling us a true story, at least as far as they know. I feel like the unreliable narrator trope or device breaks away from that in some way. Either we don't trust the narrator, or it turns out that they aren't telling us the truth. I feel like this also happens in different levels. First, when the narrator outright lies to us or leads us on in some manner. Second, when the character believes something to be true, but can't be trusted or counted on for some other reasons that we as a reader may or may not be aware of. A related third and kind of a tricky thing to add into this definition is when you can't trust a narrator because of their own bias or narrow view of the story. It's a slippery slope when you start including bias into the definition of an unreliable narrator though, because all stories are biased based on who's telling them. I think the key ingredient here may be whether or not we trust the narrator and whether or not that changes throughout the story. And also if they're being biased as part of the story in a larger sense than just their voice as a narrator. In both Eileen and The Sense of an Ending, I felt like that storyteller bias became one of the themes that we were exploring, in addition to the failure of our memories and how we perceive certain events and how that becomes our own truth. I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the Neapolitan novels, which I read this year, was the main character Lenu's voice as a narrator. This is a series of 4 books in which Lenu tells us the story of her life, but specifically through how it's connected to her childhood friend Lila. It spans years and many themes in a relationship that is sometimes codependent and sometimes awful and sometimes super loving, but always very dynamic. I found myself most often relating to Lenu, but also because of the way that the story is framed and because of some later developments in which Lenu finds some letters that Lila writes or a journal that she kept, I started to question how much of Lenu's bias was coming through in the storytelling and if we really knew all there was to Lila just from Lenu's account. I think that moment of what the author brought us to, of questioning what happened and how, really made the story all the more complicated and compelling. Another example of this, for me at least, was in The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I'm really enjoying hearing Coate Kavoth tell us his story, but it's full of the feeling that he isn't telling us everything yet, or more than that, that the story has these kind of embellishments of a storyteller. We get quotes from the book like, "You have to be a bit of a liar to tell a story the right way, and the best lies about me are the ones I told." A movie example of this is of course Forrest Gump. Forrest tells us the story of his life, but it's marked by his own naive worldview. We can't be 100% sure how many of the things that he he tells us happen exactly in that way because of his overly simplistic and naive way of seeing things and communicating them. I love these kinds of stories. Obviously, I love stories in general. I love fiction and books and media, but these kinds of stories have that additional aspect of knowing that somebody is sitting down and telling you a story. So you have Lenu in the Neapolitan novels telling you, communicating directly to you the story of her life. You have Kvoth in The Name of the Wind physically sitting down, and to the point where we have a story within a story and he's communicating the story of his life. And again, that happens in Forrest Gump, where he's almost switching locations and telling his story to different people along a chain where you know and you're clearly identifying with the storyteller. I think that's a really smart way to bring in the kind of unreliable narrator light to the tricky part of it, where you're just acknowledging the storyteller bias, and then in the back of your mind as a consumer, you always have that question of how much is this true without it being kind of an overt example of what we traditionally know as an unreliable narrator. Then we have the stories where the narrator is telling us the story as best they can, but they are missing key information if they are in some way impaired or cannot tell us the complete story, or if the narrator has misunderstood some part of their story. The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins is an example of this. This is an adult mystery thriller about the disappearance of a girl from a British suburb. We primarily follow Rachel, who is an alcoholic, and she's emotionally unstable following the dissolution of her marriage. She rides the train into the city every day and takes an interest in a seemingly happy couple that she can see from the train every day on her commute. Rachel then gets suspicious and she starts to get involved and to investigate when that woman goes missing. Mysteries are stories that are told with this kind of missing information for obvious reasons, but here in the specific book, to top it off, Rachel is an unreliable narrator. I thought this book made a couple of missteps in the storytelling, especially towards the end when it used a couple of cliches in a very in-your-face kind of way, and I didn't enjoy the ending of it. Even though it was satisfying, the way that it was told just missed the mark for me. I found this book incredibly interesting though, because it had that duality of the usual missing information of a mystery coupled with the unreliable narrator, and I thought that the use of alcoholism in the story was super interesting, especially as a way to kind of remove even more information to make us question Rachel as a narrator, and just everything it did for the story. And I don't want to get into too spoilery of a territory here, but I thought even the way that it was very repetitive, which I had an issue with, was almost very indicative of her problem with alcoholism, which is a cycle, and that whole kind of like, I'll never do it again, falling into the alcohol and then waking up the next morning regretting it. And that was a cycle that we witnessed Rachel go through, and I thought that was just so interesting. It kept me thinking after I was done reading the book, and even though I didn't highly rate this book, I encourage people to read it because I want to talk about it and about the tools that it used to tell this story specifically and to make Rachel that kind of unreliable narrator. We Were Liars is a YA thriller that fits into this category as well. I think this is the most difficult tier of this trope to pull off correctly, because with this other reason of why the narrator is unable to tell us the story fully, you can very easily run into the territory of contrivance. Things can start to seem too convenient or too predictable, and I feel like that was the problem that We Were Liars ran into. We also have the unreliable narrator, in which the narrator is purposefully withholding information from you, and a very nice and popular example of this is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. It's almost double the case here because Nick, who is the husband, we start off the story with him and we suspect him of not telling the truth. Like, we think he's not telling us all the information, and that almost gets trumped when you realize that there is another character who is also lying to you outright. We also see some of this in Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wein, though here we get lied to for very different reasons than why we get lied to in Gone Girl, and to very different effect. The lies in Gone Girl made me hate the main characters all the more, and the lies in Codename Verity made me love these characters so much. Big Big Fish almost does the opposite of what we expect from the unreliable narrator trope, and here we almost assume that the stories of the father in this book are fantasy, and by the time you get to the end, your trust of him and his stories increases, so you're almost taught that you should have believed him more than you did at the outset, which again is the opposite of the unreliable narrator, where you trust at the beginning and don't by the end. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, played around with the unreliable narrator trope a couple of times, like in season 3's The Zeppo and season 7's Storyteller. I think Storyteller did a much better job in terms of success of the story itself, but in both cases we get this minor character who's put at the forefront of an episode, and we start to see characters and the show and the story in the specific episode from their point of view, and things are so different that you almost consider them an unreliable narrator in this case, but it's just probably just a shift in point of view. I think that whole idea of shifting point of view in a show like this that is an ensemble cast was so amazing and so thoughtful and just a wonderful thing to play with in the context of the full story. On a final point, I'm not usually the person that cares about spoilers. There are times that I will specifically go out and look for spoilers because I want to satisfy my curiosity about a point, or I want to know if this is a story that I want to invest in, or if there's something in there that I will find problematic or that I know is going to stress me out in some way. So I do tend to look at spoilers for specific reasons, but if I hear spoilers about a book, that won't necessarily turn me off to reading it. Same with movies, same with the TV shows. I don't feel like spoilers are the end for me. And this is gonna sound a little funny considering the whole video I just made, but I'd rather have a direct and specific spoiler than a kind of generic, this book has a twist kind of thing, because you go into it almost expecting and picking apart every little turn and you start guessing, and I think that ruins the book more for me than just knowing a specific thing happens. And I say it's funny that I say that now because I filled this whole video with instances of books that have unreliable narrators or twists, so I've effectively done to you guys what I don't prefer being done to me, but I also realize that I actively and voluntarily participate in a book and media community. There's only so many ways that we can talk about books, and most people, I know that this is a me thing, but most people will prefer not to have a specific spoiler. So I'm curious if that is the case for you, if you guys prefer a specific spoiler, how you feel about knowing something like, oh, this book has a twist, or this book has an unreliable narrator, how that affects your reading in general. What are some of your favorite books or movies or TV shows that explore this trope, and what are some of your least favorite? Obviously, this one book, Eileen, just got me thinking about the subject and I wanted to talk about it, so this is kind of a discussion video, kind of strange and different from what I normally do, but hopefully it was enjoyable because I really enjoyed putting it together and thinking more about this topic. I'd love to talk to you guys more about it down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. I'm recording this video after work, which I generally never do. That's why it's a little darker and a little grayer outside than usual in my lighting, and I wanted to put new batteries in my ampersand back there because it was looking a little dull in the last couple of videos, and then I went to open a new pack of batteries and I decided to do so with a knife, and I stabbed myself right before the creation of this video.